The Galactic Council mocked humanity until Earth unleashed a war that broke the stars. The vote had already begun by the time I reached my seat. I was late by 4 minutes. Not because of carelessness, but because the corridor leading to the Grand Chamber had been deliberately rerouted for the human delegation. Again. The third time in 6 weeks. They never announced it as deliberate. They never had to. My name is Claire. Claire Ellison. Junior Diplomatic Liaison, Earth Council Division, 29 years old, and the only human being sitting in a chamber that holds the representatives of 61 civilizations. I carried a thin data slate, a translation earpiece, and absolutely no illusions. The chamber itself was built for grandeur. It curved upward like the inside of a shell, with tiered seating arcing around a central floor where the speaker stood. Every seat glowed faintly with the crest of its species. The Valkyrie delegation sat at the highest tier, 3 rows above everyone else, which was not an accident of architecture. It was a statement made in stone and lighting. Ambassador Drell of the Valkyrie Imperium was speaking when I sat down. He had 4 upper limbs, a voice like gravel poured down a metal pipe, and the practiced calm of someone who had never once been told no. He was not talking about Earth directly. He rarely did. Instead, he was describing the criteria for full council membership, reading from a document his delegation had submitted, a document that, by some remarkable coincidence, described requirements that no human institution currently met. Minimum technological thresholds. Minimum fleet capacity. Minimum years of interstellar presence. Minimum. The representative from the Savari Collective, a small creature the color of old paper, leaned toward her colleague and said something. Both of them covered what passed for their mouths and produced a sound that I had learned, in 8 months on this station, was laughter. No one looked at me. That was the cruelest part. When something is genuinely funny, people look at the subject of the joke to measure the reaction. They did not look at me because they did not need to. They were not performing for me. I was not even worth performing for. I opened my data slate and began writing my notes. Drell finished his reading. The translation in my ear rendered his final line as, "We must, of course, ensure that passion does not substitute for competence." He did not say the word human. He did not need to. The chamber representative from the Morith Federation, a species that had been spacefaring for 800 years, raised a ceremonial acknowledgement flag, which meant support for the statement. 12 other delegations followed. The flags went up in a slow, unhurried wave, the way people move when they are completely sure of the outcome. I kept writing. The session chair, a being called Overseer Pawn, called for any counter-statements. There was a pause. I felt every eye in the room, the ones that were eyes, anyway, drift toward the human section. Our section was 4 seats on the lower left tier, partially obscured by a structural column that had been in the way since the station was built. No one had ever offered to move it. I stood up. I did not shout. I did not tremble. I had prepared exactly 140 words, because I had been told that the attention span of the chamber for human statements averaged about that long before delegates began reviewing their own files. I said that Earth acknowledged the criteria as written. I said that humanity respected the Council's process. I said that we would continue to present our application in good faith, and that we believed patience was not weakness but evidence of genuine intent to participate, not merely to compete. Pawn thanked me in a tone that one uses to thank someone for not spilling anything. I sat down. Next to me, the only other human in the room, a senior attaché named Gordon Fry, 22 years my senior, with the kind of tired eyes that come from watching the same play performed too many times, leaned over and said, very quietly, "You did well." I looked at my notes. I had written the same thing I always wrote. Observations. Behaviors. Timing. Which delegate laughed? How long the pause lasted before the flags went up? How many contingents were present versus represented by proxy? The small mechanics of a process that had been designed, whether consciously or not, to make us feel like guests applying for permanent residence in a house that would never fully be ours. Gordon's communicator vibrated. He read whatever appeared on it. His expression did not change. Gordon Fry had one of the most controlled faces I had ever encountered, which was why I noticed the single moment of stillness that passed over him, not alarm, not surprise, but the specific blankness of a person absorbing information that changes something fundamental. He showed me the screen. 2 words. Classified routing. Earth origin. Come home. Not return at your convenience. Not please advise your schedule. Not awaiting your report. Come home. Gordon Pond was already standing, gathering his things with a quiet efficiency that I had never seen from him before. He caught me looking and said, "Leave your notes. Someone else will file the session record." I left my notes. We moved through the rerouted corridors, past the alien murals that depicted galactic history with Earth appearing in exactly one panel, small and unlabeled, near the bottom right corner. I had counted, once, how many species were depicted above us in that mural. 47. We were number 48 in size. Number 61 in relevance, if the positioning meant anything. At the docking bay, a ship was waiting that had not been on the station manifest that morning. It had no diplomatic markings. Its hull was the flat, non-reflective gray of a vessel that did not want to be remembered. Gordon walked up the ramp without slowing. I followed him. The hatch closed behind us. The ship began moving before we had fully sat down. I looked through the small porthole at the council station growing smaller behind us. Its lights blinked with the regular pulse of a functioning civilization, calm and enormous and entirely unconcerned with our departure. I thought about Drell's voice. About the laughter that had not even tried to hide itself. About the flags going up in their slow, certain wave. I thought about the word patience, and how I had used it in my statement as though it were a shield. Somewhere below us, getting closer with every second, was Earth. And Earth, apparently, had something to say. I did not sleep on the flight home. Not because the seats were uncomfortable, though they were, but because Gordon Fry spent the first 2 hours of the journey reading from a physical file, actual paper, which nobody used anymore, and refused to discuss a single word of it. Every time I leaned toward him, he turned the page away with the practiced motion of someone who had done exactly this, in exactly these circumstances, before. When we finally broke atmosphere and began descent, he closed the file, set it on his knee, and said, "What I'm about to show you stays with you. Not because you'll be threatened if you share it. Because once you see it, you won't want anyone to know you know." I said I understood. He said, "No, you don't. But you will." We landed not at any facility I recognized. The approach was long and northwest, deep into mountain terrain that my navigation display identified only as a restricted zone. The landing pad was cut directly into rock. No visible structures above ground. The kind of absence that, if you know what to look for, means there is a great deal of presence below. The elevator down took 90 seconds. I counted. 90 seconds at standard descent speed puts you somewhere around 400 meters underground. The doors opened into a corridor lit with the flat white light of deep facility installations, and I walked behind Gordon Fry into something that I can only describe, inadequately, as the inside of a held breath. The facility was enormous. That word is not enough, but I don't have a better one. It stretched in 3 directions from the central hub where we entered, with corridors branching off like the arms of something alive. People moved everywhere, but quietly. The kind of quiet that isn't forced, it's the quiet of people who know exactly what they are doing and have been doing it long enough that urgency has become rhythm. Engineers in gray. Analysts at terminals that lined the walls in unbroken rows. Logisticians with headsets moving between stations with the calm of people who do not panic because panic has been removed from the list of available options. I followed Gordon to an observation platform that overlooked the main floor below, and he stopped at the railing and said nothing. Just pointed. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. What I saw was a shipyard. But not a shipyard the way I understood the word. Every shipyard I had ever seen, and Earth had several, for our small fleet of diplomatic and science vessels, had a quality of incompleteness to it. Things in progress. Scaffolding everywhere. The appearance of a project underway. This was not a project underway. This was finished. It had been finished for some time, and now it was being prepared to move. The ships were unlike anything in the Galactic Registry. I knew the registry. I had studied it obsessively in my first year of diplomatic training because knowing the fleet capacities of other civilizations is basic political literacy. I knew what Valkyrie warships looked like. I knew the Savari patrol designs. I knew the long, elegant spines of Morith scientific vessels. These looked like none of them. They were dark, not painted, but constructed of a material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Their shapes were angular in some places and swept in others, the way something looks when it has been designed not for appearance but for a single, specific purpose. They sat in their berths in long rows that disappeared into the far end of the facility, and I could not see the end of the rows. A woman approached from my left. Her name, as she introduced herself, was Dr. Ada North. She had the look of someone who slept 4 hours and considered it sufficient. She carried no file, no slate. She spoke from memory. She said the program had a name internally, but the name was not important. What was important was the timeline. 31 years. The program had been running for 31 years, funded through 17 different budget categories across 9 different government departments, none of which individually suggested what the sum of them was building. I asked her how many ships. She said 3,412. Fully crewed. Armed. Provisioned for extended engagement. I gripped the railing. She continued. The doctrine, she explained, was developed in the first decade. It was not based on alien military theory, because alien military theory assumed a shared framework of what conflict costs and what an acceptable outcome looks like. Human military theorists had noticed, early, that humans calculated those things differently. Other species fought to win. Humans fought even when winning looked improbable, and sometimes especially then. The doctrine formalized that tendency and turned it into a system. Not recklessness. Precision. The precise application of sustained, unrelenting pressure, designed to outlast an enemy's willingness to continue. She called it the persistence framework. Gordon, standing beside me, said quietly, "You were not in that council chamber to represent Earth. You were there so they would watch you while they weren't watching us." It landed like a stone dropped into still water. 8 months. 8 months of rerouted corridors and flags going up in slow, contemptuous waves and laughter that didn't bother to lower its voice. 8 months of me standing up and speaking my 140 carefully chosen words while Gordon sat beside me with tired eyes, and none of it had been diplomacy in the way I understood diplomacy. It had been a performance designed to hold attention in one direction. I had been the distraction. Willingly, without knowing it, I had been the hand the magician shows the audience. I started to speak. I'm not sure what I was going to say. Ada North stopped me. She said, 4 hours ago, a Valkyrie strike force destroyed Kepris Station. I knew Kepris. It was a human colony. A small one, as colonies went. Mining and research, mostly. Families. Schools. A population of 412,000 people who had gone there because Earth was getting crowded and the stars were open and humanity had never been very good at staying still. Ada North said it again. Destroyed. Not attacked. Not damaged. Destroyed. The room continued its quiet rhythm around us. No one was running. No one was raised. The information had already moved through this facility and been absorbed, and what was left was the stillness on the other side of it. Gordon Fry, who had the most controlled face I had ever seen, turned away from the railing for a moment. Just a moment. Ada North looked at me steadily. She said, "The Council has issued a statement of deep concern." I did not say anything. She said, "We are not going to the Council." From somewhere deep in the facility, past the rows of dark ships and the quiet engineers and the 31 years of patient, deliberate, invisible work, a sound began. Not an alarm. Not a signal. The sound of engines waking up. Ada North handed me a uniform. It was the same flat gray as the walls, the same non-reflective tone as the halls outside. She said there was a role for me, if I wanted it. Strategic liaison. Translation, not of language but of intent, someone who understood the Council's thinking from the inside, who could tell command what the political response would be before it happened. I looked at the uniform in my hands. 412,000 people. A statement of deep concern. I put the uniform on. Ada North said, "Good." She turned toward the platform steps and added, without looking back, "We leave in 6 hours. Sleep if you can." I looked out over the rows of dark ships one more time. 3,412. Each one built in secret, over 31 years, by people who understood something that the Valkyrie and the Council and everyone who had ever laughed at the idea of Earth as a peer had not understood. Humanity does not give up. It is not a choice. It is not a policy. It is simply what we are. I had thought, for 8 months, that patience was the shield. I had been wrong. Patience was not the shield. It was the sword. And now it was drawn. The fold took 11 hours. 11 hours of compressed, lightless transit, during which the flagship, the vessel I had been assigned to, long and dark and named internally only as Unit 7, which I thought was either very practical or very ominous, hummed at a frequency you felt in your back teeth more than heard with your ears. I spent 8 of those hours at a workstation in the Strategic Coordination Room, reviewing everything the Council had ever filed on Valkyrie military doctrine. Not their published assessments. The assessments buried 3 levels into the archive, the ones that other species had submitted confidentially and that Earth's intelligence team had spent years quietly reconstructing from partial data. The Valkyrie had never lost a first strike. Not once in 300 years of recorded conflict. They struck fast, they struck overwhelming, and by the time the target had organized a response, the Valkyrie were already dictating terms. Their entire military identity was built on that sequence. Speed, then dominance, then negotiation from a position where the other party had no real choice. What they had never encountered was an opponent who looked at that sequence and simply refused to follow the script. Captain Henry Cole found me at my station at hour 9. He was a quiet man, the kind of quiet that comes from genuine calm rather than suppression. He had commanded warships for 16 years, starting with Earth's small diplomatic escort fleet and moving, at some point I did not have clearance to know about, into this program. He sat across from me, looked at my screen, and said, "What are you reading?" I told him. He nodded slowly. He said, "Their commanders are going to expect us to retreat after the first exchange. Every opponent they have ever faced retreated after the first exchange, because the first exchange against the Valkyrie is always bad. Our doctrine accounts for that." I asked him what the doctrine said about the first exchange. He said, "Take it. Absorb it. And keep moving." I looked at him for a moment. I said, "That sounds like it costs a great deal." He said, "Yes." He didn't elaborate. He stood up and moved back toward the bridge, and I sat with the word yes for a long time afterward. Fold exit was announced without ceremony. The viewport, which had shown nothing for 11 hours but the deep, formless dark of fold space, suddenly filled with stars again. Real stars. Fixed and bright and honest. Ahead of us, the Valkyrie veil. It was not called a veil because of beauty. It was called a veil because of the electromagnetic interference generated by the Valkyrie's outer defense grid, a shimmering, layered curtain of signal disruption that covered their forward systems like a second atmosphere. For 3 centuries, nothing had passed through the veil without Valkyrie permission. It was the boundary of their certainty. Beyond it, they were untouchable. On the tactical display, 3,412 signatures appeared as Unit 7's fleet completed fold exit around us. They materialized in precise formation, each ship in its assigned position, no drift, no delay. 31 years of training expressing itself in a single coordinated breath. I heard the communications officer report that Valkyrie perimeter sensors had registered our arrival. 40 seconds later, a broadcast came through on the standard galactic frequency, the Valkyrie demanding identification, demanding we state our purpose, demanding we hold position or face response. Captain Cole said, "Cut the channel." The communications officer cut the channel. What followed was not heroic. I want to be clear about that, because I have heard the stories people tell afterward, and they tend to become something cleaner and larger than what it actually was. What it actually was 3,000 ships crossing a boundary that had been uncrossed for 300 years, and on the other side, a Valkyrie defense force that had been calibrated for every opponent except this one. The first wave of Valkyrie fire was enormous. It was, by any objective measure, devastating. 14 human ships were destroyed in the opening minutes. 14 crews. I knew the ship numbers. I had memorized the ship numbers the night before because Ada North had told me that if I was going to serve in this role, I needed to understand that the numbers on a tactical display were not abstractions. 14 ships. I watched the display. I watched the gaps where those ships had been. 2 ships moved into each gap. The Valkyrie commanders, according to the signals intelligence we were intercepting in real time, initially classified this as a targeting error. Then as a reserve deployment. Then, after 40 minutes of continuous engagement during which the human fleet absorbed every strike and replaced every loss and kept advancing, their classification system apparently stopped generating new categories and simply began reporting that the enemy was not behaving as expected. That phrase, "not behaving as expected," appeared in their intercepted communications 11 times in the first 2 hours. I translated the political implications for Captain Cole at regular intervals. I told him that the Valkyrie High Command would not call for negotiation until the engagement crossed a threshold that made continuation more expensive than concession, and that the threshold was not purely military, it was reputational. They had never asked for a ceasefire. Not once, in 300 years. The cost of asking, to them, was not tactical. It was existential. They would push past reason before they would ask. Cole said, then we push past their reason. The battle continued into the 6th hour. I stopped counting exchanges and started watching the pattern instead. The Valkyrie were excellent fighters. I want to say that clearly because the truth matters more than the story. They were fast, they were disciplined, and they adapted with each cycle. But their adaptations assumed that at some point the human fleet would reach a level of loss that would trigger withdrawal. Every tactical adjustment they made was built on that assumption. The assumption was wrong. On hour 7, something shifted in the Valkyrie command communications. The phrase "not behaving as expected" disappeared. What replaced it was shorter and appeared only once, in a direct exchange between two senior Valkyrie commanders. My translation earpiece rendered it as, "What are they?" I wrote that down. I still have that note somewhere. At hour 8, the Council emergency channel activated. I could see the signal on the communications board from across the room. Pond's station had initiated contact. The Council wanted to speak with the fleet commander. The Council was requesting an immediate pause. The Council was framing it in the language of humanitarian concern and galactic stability. The Valkyrie ambassador was, according to a secondary intercept, in the Council chamber at that exact moment, requesting intervention. I had sat in that chamber. I had heard the laughter. I had counted the flags going up. Captain Cole looked at me across the coordination room. He did not ask my opinion. He asked, "What will they do if we don't respond?" I said, "Issue a resolution." He turned back to his display. We did not respond. The battle lasted 19 hours in total. At the end of it, the Valkyrie Veil, the electromagnetic barrier that had stood for 3 centuries as the symbol of their invulnerability, had been breached, pushed back, and disrupted across a 14-system span. Their forward fleet had retreated to their core systems. Their defense grid was operating at a fraction of its design capacity. We had lost 206 ships. I read that number carefully when it appeared on my display, and I held it with the same weight that I had held 14, and thought about how numbers do not feel smaller just because a larger number exists. 206. I wrote them all down. That night, or what counted as night in the timeless interior of a warship, I sat at my workstation and stared at the empty space on the tactical display where the Valkyrie Veil used to be, and I thought about Gordon Fry saying "come home," and Ada North handing me a uniform, and the sound of engines waking up in a mountain 400 meters underground. 31 years. This had been coming for 31 years. And it had only just begun. The first time I saw the kindling array fire, I was standing at the rear observation port of Unit 7, holding a mug of cold tea that I had forgotten to drink, watching a Valkyrie Star Fortress die. I need to be accurate about what I felt, because what I felt was not simple. The fortress was called the Iron Meridian. It had stood at the center of the Valkyrie's 3rd core system for 140 years. It was a structure large enough to be visible to the naked eye from the surface of the nearest habitable planet. It had never been attacked. It had, as far as the Valkyrie were concerned, never needed to be defended. It was simply there, the way mountains are there, permanent, foundational, beyond question. 3 human scientists had spent 11 years telling their program directors that quantum-level destabilization of a fortress power core was theoretically impossible. 2 of those scientists had been reassigned. One of them, a man named Dr. Peter Flood, had stayed and spent the following 8 years proving that the theory needed to be revised, not the experiment. The kindling array fired once. What followed was not an explosion in the conventional sense. It was more like watching something stop being solid. The Iron Meridian, which had stood for 140 years, simply ceased to cohere. Its structure came apart from the inside outward, without fire, without debris fields, without the dramatic spectacle of conventional destruction. It became, in the space of 40 seconds, a dispersing cloud of component materials. Dust and signal and silence. The shock wave, not physical, but electromagnetic, was detectable from 3 star systems away. I stood at the observation port and did not move for a long time. Captain Cole found me there. He stood beside me without speaking for a moment, then said, "You're thinking about whether we went too far." I said, "Yes." He said, "Good. You should be." I turned to look at him. He was watching the dispersing cloud with an expression that had no triumph in it at all. I had expected something else. I had expected the face that commanders are supposed to make at decisive moments, settled, resolved, certain. What I saw instead was something more like the face of a man at a funeral who is holding himself together by choice. He said, "The fortress was evacuated 22 hours before we fired. Valkyrie Command pulled their people out when we breached the outer perimeter. We knew they would. We waited." I had not known that. Ada North's team had not briefed me on it. I realized, standing there, that it had been kept from me deliberately, not because my opinion did not matter, but because if I had known in advance, I would have spent the preceding 22 hours with a different kind of weight on my shoulders, and I needed to be functional. The fortress was empty. No one died in the Iron Meridian. I felt something release in my chest that I had not known was held. Then Cole said, "The secondary target was not evacuated." I looked at him. He said, "Valkyrie Command was meeting in transit. Mobile command vessel. They did not know we had cracked their location protocol." He paused. "We chose not to fire." I waited. He said, "We need them able to make decisions. And we need those decisions to be made by people who understand what we are capable of, not by whoever replaces them." He looked at me. "That is a strategic calculation. I'm not going to pretend it is anything else." I understood what he was saying. He was telling me, with precision and honesty, where the line was that they had drawn and why. Not because the line was clean. Because the line was theirs, and they had thought about it. The council channel had been active for 16 hours by that point. Pawn had sent 41 separate requests for communication. The Valkyrie ambassador had filed a formal emergency petition. 6 other council delegations had co-signed a joint statement calling for immediate cessation of hostilities and arbitration. I reviewed the joint statement and brought it to the senior command briefing that afternoon. I read it aloud. When I finished, I told them what I assessed it meant. I said, "They are not afraid for the Valkyrie. The Valkyrie have other enemies and other crises, and the Council has watched them without much concern for a long time. What frightens the Council is that they cannot predict us. They built their entire framework of galactic governance on the assumption that every species, once it reaches a certain point, becomes legible, its behavior follows known patterns, its ambitions fit known categories. We do not fit." Admiral Grace Hartley, who commanded the 3rd Fleet Division and who had said perhaps 12 words to me in the 3 weeks since launch, looked up from the briefing table and said, "Is that a problem?" I said, "Not for us." She almost smiled. Almost. The Valkyrie request for armistice came 17 hours after the Iron Meridian's dissolution. It came not through the Council channel, which I found interesting, but through a direct military frequency, ship to ship, command to command. It bypassed the entire political apparatus, which meant that their commanders had decided to deal with us directly, without the Council as intermediary. That was, in its own way, a form of recognition. Captain Cole brought the request to me for translation of intent. I read it carefully. I said, "They are asking for terms. They are not asking for mercy. There is a difference, and they are being deliberate about it. They want to preserve enough standing to present this to their own population as a strategic decision rather than a defeat." Cole said, "Can we give them that?" I thought about Kepris. I thought about 412,000 people and a council statement of deep concern. I thought about 31 years of dark ships in a mountain and rerouted corridors and laughter that did not bother to look up. I said, "That depends on what we ask for in return." What Earth asked for was simple. I drafted the conditions myself, and I kept them to 3 points. Full diplomatic recognition of Earth as a sovereign peer civilization. Immediate elevation to full council membership, without conditions and without the process of minimum thresholds. And a seat at the council table. Not at the edge of the room. Not partially behind a structural column. At the center arc, where the recognized powers sat. The Valkyrie transmitted the conditions to the council simultaneously with their armistice request. The council called an emergency session. I monitored the feed from the coordination room. The session lasted 5 hours and 53 minutes. The session where Earth's original membership application had been discussed, the one where Drell had read his list of minimums and the flags had gone up in their slow certain wave, had lasted 2 days. 5 hours and 53 minutes. They agreed. I sat at my workstation and read the agreement text 3 times to make sure I was reading it correctly. Then I set the data slate down and looked at the ceiling of the coordination room, which was the same flat gray as everything else in the facility, and thought about what had just happened. 412,000 people could not be brought back. That was the weight that sat underneath everything, and it would always sit there. The agreement did not change it. The Iron Meridian's dissolution did not change it. Nothing that came next would change it. But the answer had been given. And it would not be forgotten. Captain Cole found me for the 3rd time, and for the 3rd time he said nothing for a moment, and then he said something true. He said, "Now comes the harder part." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Winning is not the end of anything. It's the beginning of the part where you decide who you are now that you have power." I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "I know." He nodded. He went back to the bridge. I stayed at my workstation a little longer, looking at the agreement text, thinking about the harder part. Thinking about what I would say when I walked back into that chamber. Thinking about the center arc, and the seat that would be waiting, and what it meant to sit in it with all of this behind you. I picked up the data slate. I opened a new document. I started writing. The station smelled exactly the same. I had thought it might not. I had spent the transit back telling myself that surely something would feel different, that a place cannot retain its character when the balance of power around it has shifted this dramatically. I was wrong. The Galactic Council station smelled of recycled air and alien compounds and the specific dry warmth of a place that has been inhabited, continuously, by several hundred species for 3 centuries. It smelled of itself. It would always smell of itself. My name is still Claire. Claire Ellison. Now 30 years old. No longer junior anything. I had been assigned, in the weeks after the armistice, a formal title that was several words long and meant, essentially, that when I spoke, I was speaking for Earth. For all of it. For every human being who had ever stood in a council chamber and been laughed at and kept standing. That is a weight I carried with both hands. The corridor leading to the grand chamber was the direct route. No rerouting. The station's navigation system had been updated, that was the official language, updated, to reflect Earth's new status. For weeks ago, the path to my seat took an extra 11 minutes and past a mural in which humanity was unlabeled and placed near the bottom right. Today I walked the direct corridor, which was shorter and better lit and passed no murals at all. Small things. They add up. Gordon Fry walked beside me. He had been assigned as senior ambassador, which was the right choice, and he wore the title the way he wore everything else, without visible weight, as though it had always been there. He had said, on the transport, that he was proud of how things had gone. He had said it simply, without ceremony, and I had understood that for Gordon Fry, simplicity was the highest register of sincerity. The chamber was full. Every delegation was present. Not represented by proxy, present. Physically occupying their seats, in person, for the first time at a non-emergency session in what the council records indicated was quite some time. The word had moved ahead of us, as words do, and everyone wanted to see the humans take their seat. I walked to the center arc. The Valkyrie section was visible from where I sat. It was 3 rows up and to the right, in the elevated tier. Ambassador Drell was present. He looked exactly the same as he had at every session I had ever attended, 4 upper limbs, voice like gravel, the practiced calm of someone accustomed to authority. He looked at me. I looked at him. I did not look away. I did not narrow my eyes or set my jaw. I simply met his gaze with the same steadiness I would have given anyone in that room, held it for a moment that was long enough to be intentional, and then turned my attention to the session materials in front of me. Overseer Pon opened the session. The formal acknowledgement of Earth's membership was brief. Councils are not ceremonial bodies in the way that public audiences imagine. The recognition was filed, the credentials were entered into the record, and the session moved forward. I had expected something more. I had expected, perhaps, that someone would say something. A formal welcome. A word of acknowledgement for what had occurred. What I got was the session moving forward. Which was, I realized, exactly right. Because the thing we had been asking for 31 years, was not to be welcomed. It was to be treated as though our presence required no explanation. As though we simply were there, the way the Valkyrie were there, and the Morith, and the Savari. As though belonging required no ceremony because belonging was just a fact. The session moved forward. The first item was a routine infrastructure dispute between two outer system civilizations. Pan called for statements. 3 delegations offered brief remarks. I listened. I made notes. The notes were different from the notes I had kept for 8 months as a junior liaison. Those notes had been observations of behavior, small mechanics, the anatomy of how power moved in this room. These notes were substantive. Policy. Position. The kind of notes you take when you intend to respond. The second item was a request for emergency humanitarian assistance from a civilization called the Narati. I had not heard of the Narati before the session brief, which meant they were either very new to the galactic community or very isolated, and the brief suggested both. They were, by any measure, a young species. Their world had been spacefaring for fewer than 40 years. Their technology was modest. Their delegation was represented by a single individual, a small woman named Deputy Envoy Lila Sharp, a human name, which startled me until the brief clarified that the Narati had made first contact with a human explorer vessel 12 years ago and adopted certain human linguistic conventions in their formal communications. Lila Sharp, Deputy Envoy of the Narati, stood at the speaker's position in the center of the chamber floor. She was young. She held her data slate with both hands. She spoke clearly and without rushing, which I recognized as the discipline of someone who has rehearsed against their own nerves. She described what had happened to her world. A natural disaster, a seismic event of unusual scale that had disrupted their primary agricultural infrastructure. They were not asking for military assistance or diplomatic intervention. They were asking for food supply support. A temporary measure. Enough to carry their population through the next 18 months while their own recovery systems were rebuilt. It was a small request. Genuinely small, by galactic standards. The chamber was quiet when she finished. Pan asked for initial responses. The Morith delegation submitted a brief statement noting that such matters were typically handled through the Outer Systems Humanitarian Fund, which the Narati were not yet members of because their membership application was incomplete. The Valkyrie section was silent. 3 other delegations reviewed their materials. No one raised a flag. I had not planned to speak. The agenda item was not in my briefing as something requiring Earth's involvement. I had intended to listen, observe, get a feel for the rhythm of the room in my new capacity before introducing positions on anything substantive. I stood up. Gordon, beside me, glanced over. He said nothing. I said that Earth supported the Narati request in full. I said that the procedural point about the humanitarian fund was correct in its facts and irrelevant to the situation, because the situation was not a procedural one, it was a practical one. A population needed food. The mechanism for providing it was available. The only variable was willingness. I said that Earth would commit its own resources to the initial supply effort, independent of any fund or procedural process, effective immediately, and that we invited any delegation that wished to join that commitment to do so. The chamber was quiet. Then the Savari Collective raised its flag. Then the Morith Federation. Then, after a pause that was several seconds long and visible to everyone in the room, a flag went up from a delegation I had not expected. A small civilization called the Thurin, who had never, in my 8 months of observation, volunteered for anything that did not directly benefit their own trade interests. 4 flags. 5. 6. I sat down. Gordon leaned toward me and said, very quietly, "You did well." I did not answer him. I was watching the flags go up. Watching how they moved, and how many, and how fast, and from whom. Lila Sharp, the Narati deputy envoy, was still standing at the center of the chamber floor. She was watching the flags go up. She was holding her data slate with both hands, and she was very still, and from where I sat I could see that she was working very hard to maintain her composure. I understood that. I knew exactly what it felt like to stand in that room and watch something go your way that you had not been sure would go your way. I filed it away. After the session, in the corridor outside the chamber, the direct corridor, better lit, no murals, I passed Ambassador Drell. He was moving in the opposite direction, with his delegation, and we were briefly adjacent. The corridor was wide enough that there was no need for either of us to acknowledge the other. He stopped. I stopped. He said something in Valkyrie. My earpiece translated it. He said, "You were more prepared than we understood." I considered several responses. I chose the one that was most honest and, I thought, most useful for whatever came next between our peoples. I said, "We were always prepared." You were just not watching. He looked at me for a moment. Then he continued down the corridor. I stood there for a moment and thought about what I had said. I thought about whether it was the right thing to say, whether it was too pointed, whether diplomacy required softness where I had offered edge. I decided it was fine. It was true, and it was clear, and what we needed now more than softness was clarity, clarity about what Earth was, what we had done, and what we intended to be. That evening I sat in my new quarters on the station, larger than my previous ones, a different section, a window that actually faced outward rather than toward an interior corridor, and I watched the stars. From the council station you could see, on clear sensor readings, the general direction of Kepris. It was too far to see the planet itself, obviously. But the direction existed. The vector. The coordinates. 412,000 people. I said their number aloud, just once, in the empty room. It is important not to let numbers become only numbers. I had learned that in this last year. From Ada North, who handed me a uniform. From Captain Cole, who told me that winning was the beginning of the harder part. From the 206 ships that had gone into the fight and not come back. From Lila Sharp, standing in the center of the chamber floor with both hands on her data slate. Numbers are not abstractions. They are people. And people are the whole point. I opened my notes file. I had been keeping it since my first day on the station, 18 months ago, the observations, the behaviors, the small mechanics. I kept it now. I would always keep it. Not because I needed it for strategy anymore, though it was still useful for that. But because it was a record. A record of what this place was and what it had been and what it was becoming. And I intended to help shape what it became. Tomorrow there would be another session. More items on the agenda. More delegations with positions and interests and histories that I would need to understand. There would be moments where I would have to decide, again, where the line was between firmness and cruelty, between standing for Earth and standing for something larger than Earth. There would be moments of uncertainty. There would be moments of doubt. I was glad there would be doubt. Doubt is not weakness. Doubt is what happens when you care about getting it right. I looked at the stars for a long time. Then I looked at the center of the window, where the station's own light fell softly against the outside of the glass, and I thought about the chamber, and the seat, and the flags going up. Not in a slow certain wave, the way they used to go up when contempt was the operating principle of this place. One by one. Each one a choice. Each one a small piece of something being built. Humanity had been mocked in this place. Humanity had been laughed at, routed through longer corridors, placed behind structural columns, treated as a guest at a table we were not welcome to own. And then humanity had answered. Not with cruelty, but with 31 years of patient, invisible, extraordinary work. And then with ships. And then with silence where there used to be apology. And then with a seat at the center arc and a flag raised for a people we had never met. We had not become what they feared we would become. We had not become conquerors, or tyrants, or the tantrum species finally given enough power to do real damage. We had become, instead, exactly what we had always said we were. Partners. Peers. Members. And we intended to stay that way. I closed my notes file. I turned off the desk light. The stars outside were still there, fixed and bright and honest, the way they always are. I thought about Gordon Fry's tired eyes, and Ada North's 4 hours of sleep, and Peter Flood spending 8 years revising the theory until the impossible became merely difficult, and Henry Cole saying come home in 2 quiet words that changed everything. I thought about 31 years. All those people. All that patience. All that belief, held quietly, without applause, in the deep dark of a mountain 400 meters underground, that the moment would come and we would be ready. We were ready. And now the work that mattered most was just beginning.